We are very, very pleased to introduce my friends and colleagues, Ian Stockwell and Leigh. Now, could you pronounce your last name?
It's Goetschius. I know it's
Goetschius. I have got
one.
to get that. Thank you. These are my colleagues from UMBC, and Ian and I have been working together for years now on dementia-related projects. And Leigh and I and Ian have been working on new proposals for different things, for things that relate to kind of developing risk tools and clinical decision support tools, all of which are related to kind of improving dementia care. And so I'm going to just introduce them by reading just a short bio. So Dr. Ian Stockwell is an associate professor who focuses on the use of data to improve healthcare systems. He joined academia recently after 20 years in healthcare operations, where he led the quantitative analysis of diverse healthcare data and oversaw methodological approaches to public health interventions, social drivers of health, and healthcare financing. He is a proud UMBC alum many times over, with bachelor degrees in information systems and financial economics, a master's in economic policy analysis, and a PhD in public policy. So welcome, Ian. And Leigh Goetschius, oh gosh, is a data scientist at the Hilltop Institute at UMBC, where she conducts research and quantitative analysis for a variety of projects. She has broad training in developmental psychology, with specific training in integrating social context and biological data using advanced quantitative methods. At Hilltop, Leigh contributes to the predictive modeling infrastructure for the portfolio of preventive models designed to enhance primary care for Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries in Maryland, and contributes to Hilltop's ongoing work on a range of different topics and initiatives, including maternal and child health initiatives, predictive models and decision support tools for dementia care, firearm violence prevention, all with a special focus on the impact of these programs on health equity. So welcome, Leigh and Ian. We're really happy to have you, and I will turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Quincy. And we are very happy to be here and honored that so many folks would take their lunch hour and instead of spending it having a nice meal, instead sit and listen to us. So thank you for your time. We will spend it the best that we can, and I hope that it's as helpful for you as it is an honor for us to be here. And though saying that, I will say that it's a lot of content to go over, and I'm not really a slide person. So I'm going to kind of riff a lot, and I would really encourage people to ask questions as they have them, because as you all know, being scholars, it is hard to know what someone else wants to know with all the stuff that's in your head. So if you want to deviate, have add-on questions, clarifying questions, feel free to throw them out. So that's one. And two is this may feel a little different than what you were expecting, because the first chunk of what we talk about is not research. It is very much not research, right? It is healthcare operations. It is building something that could be and was and is in the real world out there doing things. And we were able to do such things because of the unique kind of organizational structure that we have here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's important context. And then we'll talk about what we built. We'll talk about how it works. And then the very end, we're going to talk about how we want to use it to research and the fascinating stuff that we're doing with Quincy that's going to get us there. So hopefully we can do all that in an hour. Again, feel free to ask questions. So thank you again, Quincy. Again, my name's Ian, and we had to pick a title for this conversation. So we picked Applied Predictive Modeling for Alzheimer's and Related Dementias. There are 100 other titles we could have picked that would still make sense, but that's what we went with. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start. I mentioned the organizational piece, and I am not a total like organizational bureaucracy nerd, but having been at the UMBC for 25 years and having been at the Hilltop Institute for 20 of them, I understand and have seen kind of the power of different organizational structures and how they do and don't work, right? So Quincy mentioned that most recently I was a chief data scientist at Hilltop. And for those of you who don't know, the Hilltop Institute is based at UMBC, and it is unique in that it is a university research center, right? That is its designation within the system of Maryland. But by and large, its funding doesn't come from research, right? Research in the kind of federal sense that we're doing work to, expand the body of knowledge. The vast majority of its funding comes from contracts, and by and large, those contracts are with other state entities, such as the Maryland Department of Health, and those entities pay Hilltop to do things to help enhance their healthcare operations, right? So it's help run the Medicaid program and make the Medicaid program better. It's help setting rates for the Medicaid program. It's help visualizing hospital discharge data. It's help doing registries for communicable diseases. It's help doing public health outreach and informatics. And all of these things are very much health IT, very much health IT operations, but not funded in the traditional federal grant mechanism or nonprofit philanthropic grants. So that's the world that was my world for 20 years. And I loved it, right? Because I was able to do things, and Leigh now is able to do things that we can see the effects out in the world because they're doing things that are out there. And while I was at Hilltop, I had a lot of interactions with faculty, and I met so many faculty that did these amazing things that didn't leave their lab. And I was like, I'd meet with these people and they tell me about the cool problems they're solving. And I'm like, oh, awesome. Like, what is that piece of code doing now? And they're like, well, it's sitting on my laptop. And I'm like, where else is it? And they're like, on my laptop. And I'm like, well, that's not right, right? Like, what you're doing has value, and it has value out in the world. I would suggest that you should, in addition to writing awesome papers about it, get that out there, right? So part of it's like tech transfer, part of it's like we need to be more flexible about academics get research money and staff get operations money. We need to change it up because there shouldn't be this kind of hard wall between research and operations work. And I didn't get very far with that. So my second approach was, okay, well, I'm just going to become faculty because I can't fix it from the staff side. So I'm going to try and fix it from the faculty side. I don't know if it's going to work, but we're going to try. And so that is why I am so honored that even after that long-winded explanation, the heads folks still decided to have Leigh and I, because right now we're in very different worlds, right? Where I am judged on research, although I think research and operations, again, don't have to be totally separate, and Leigh is judged by operations, but she is such a beautiful researcher, that part shouldn't be shunned either. So the overall goal, which we're going to try to stitch together in these parts, is to knock down that wall, right? We can build things for research purposes that go right into operations. After vetting, of course, we can build things to fix real problems through operations and contracts that we can write research papers about, because we learn a lot of stuff by building these things and having them out in the world. So that's what we're trying to do. Probably way too ambitious, but I'm still relatively young and Leigh's much younger than I, so we have some time. This is Hilltop's mission. Again, important to know because it is what it exists for in an operational context. And it serves kind of the state university, right? Like, we have state funding and we need to serve the state. And that's what we try to do as researchers here at UMBC, and certainly why Hilltop exists. Next slide, please. Okay, so that being said, when we have worked with our clients at the Maryland Department of Health, we have had so many wonderful discussions and built so many cool things. What we were lucky enough to be able to engage with the state in was truly the creation of a new program, right? And that new program back then was called the Maryland Primary Care Program. The Maryland Primary Care Program does a lot of things. I won't list them all, but what we could inject into that conversation, right, was this idea, very simply, that risk, right, the word risk was not just financial risk, right? That was this key concept and the seed really that we grew, because in the healthcare operations world, by and large, when people say risk, they mean actuarial risk, right? How much is someone going to cost next year? That's what I want to know, because that's going to drive my decisions. Our suggestion was, in fact, that while that is important, for the coordination of care, it is not the most important meaning of risk, right? What we wanted to shift the conversation from was that risk is actuarial risk. And what we wanted to shift it to was that risk is event risk, right? The risk of a bad thing happening to someone, and not necessarily over a year's timeline, but shorter than that, right? And we got to decide what that bad thing was. Not we, Leigh and I, but we, the broader we, got to define our event, and that became our events, right? The things that we want to predict, and then assign risk to, so that within the kind of this broad, mission of the Maryland Primary Care Program, we could guide care coordination with interventions that were specific to the event that we were predicting the risk of, right? We could guide those to the people at the highest risk of that event. It's triage, right? We did not invent this, but what we were able to do was change the conversation so that when people thought of risk, they didn't think of how much is this person going to cost me next year. They thought of what is the likelihood of this bad thing that we can prevent happening to this person, so that when I know that my care coordinators can only get to 5% of my population, right, or 10% or 1%, whatever it is, that they're being as efficient as possible, right? They are interacting with the highest proportion of people who may actually have that thing happen to them as they can, right? So that was the philosophy, and that was a big change, and it took a long time to shift the conversation. And certainly I don't fault anyone for being hesitant, to kind of change the structure, but I am so glad that they did, because it let us do some really cool things and change the workflow. Next slide, please. All right. So once we had changed the dynamic, right, we kind of changed the conversation and suggested that risk can mean many things, and some measures of risk could be used for some things like rate setting, and others could be used for other things like triage. Then it was on us, right, to figure out how we were going to define and assign that risk. So what we did, I and the others on our team, luckily we all agreed that the feature engineering stage, right, the creation of risk factors that were relevant and valid and interpretable, that was like our starting point, right? It was not throw 100 million claims into TensorFlow and see what popped out. It was, how do we define very clearly the event that we're trying to predict? How do we define very clearly each of our predictors in a way that we could then feed that back to the users of the model, and they would understand what they mean. So that's what we did. We have very strict definitions of our adverse event. Our first model predicted avoidable hospitalizations. We've since built some other models, which I'll talk about later. And then we grouped our risk factors into these domains: utilization, socio-environmental, conditions, diagnoses, demographic, and pharmacy. And within each of those domains, there's anywhere from 10 to, like 100, I guess, individual risk factors, right? So the feature engineering part, that was the hardest. We read, I don't even know how many articles, because we wanted to pick features that had been vetted in the literature for the most part. and we built this matrix. This is all available on the website if you're interested. But we were very careful in curating what drove this model, right? Because what we wanted to feed back again was not just a likelihood score, right, 0 to 1, but the reasons why the person's risk was what it was. And so this was a really important step. Next slide, please. All right, so these are the models that are in production right now. So pre-AH was our first model that's been live for 3+ years now, which it's like growing up, it's amazing. Pre-AI is kind of a smaller model, but it's and a smaller cohort, but it's been live about the same amount of time. We predict readmissions, we predict COVID hospitalizations, diabetes complications, and hospice eligibility, which is like we're aiming for 6 months prior to death. So these are the events that we're predicting, right? Each of them builds off of the same kind of standard pool of covariates. So what we did was we built our first model pre-H, and we built the pool of covariates. And then as we add models, as we add events that we want to predict, we go back to the literature, look for other risk factors that are significant predictors of that event. Are they in our current pool? If the answer is no, then we add them in, right? And we let all the models choose from this risk pool. I don't know how many risk factors we're up to now, well over 200. But it seems to work well. And again, these are, vetted, curated features of the model, which I think has helped us in explaining how the model works to the stakeholders that we've interacted with. Next slide, please. Okay, we have one model that should be in production, but is not, and it's opioid overdose. For those of you who work with substance abuse or mental health data, you could probably guess why this has been a pain. And it's 42 CFR Part 2 protected data. And it is really hard to convince a bunch of lawyers to let us do things with those data, which is both frustrating and understandable because it is, personal data, and it's there's a lot of stigma still attached to those conditions. So this is, we basically have the model built. We haven't been able to train it because we haven't been able to get the right training data. There's still questions on deployment and how do we present this to providers and care coordinators. So this one's still in the pipeline, not because mechanically it's any different or methodologically it's any different, but legally and kind of public perception, it's in a different spot. So we're still working on that one. Next slide, please. Okay, so Leigh is an excellent graphic artist. And apparently in one of our conversations, I mentioned that I thought of like this predictive infrastructure as a road, and then each model is like a driving down the road. And so she made this, and I think it is beautiful, right? Because again, this kind of operational mindset, right? What we were able to do was not build our first model as a one-off, right? But we built it in a way that we could add models to it easily, not because of anyone's brilliance, but because we knew that this was going to be out in the field serving 2 million people, right? And we needed to make it like production level software. So what that allows us to do is add on to it fairly easily, right? We can identify new events that we want to predict. We can identify new risk factors, and we plug them in to the infrastructure, and we can create a model. And I will say, and Leigh's going to get into this a little bit, these cars, these models that we're building, we don't want to build Ferraris, right? These aren't Formula One race cars, right? This is like the Ford pickup truck driving down the road, doing work, right? Like we aim for simple over fancy. If we can increase interpretability for the users, we will give up a little bit of predictive power, right? Like this is not, we're not trying to build the best model ever. We're trying to build something that works and will work, and that people can believe in. right? So it's, I don't know, it's worked so far. Next slide, please. All right, and I think I'm going to hand it over to Leigh, and then I'll come back at the end.
One little slide, because I had a nice transition planned that incorporated this slide. Pick up again here. So I think Ian has just given you all a really great overview of the philosophy that's underlying these predictive, like our predictive model infrastructure suite, whatever, and then sort of has gone over the different cars that we have on the road here. And so from here, I'll talk a little bit about like the actual road itself, and how we get the actual predictive model risk scores, and like the infrastructure and processes underlying that helps us get these risk scores to care managers and providers. So sort of how the data is translated into actual actionable information. And so that process really starts even before what's shown on this slide here, because it's, as Ian said, really sort of figuring out what that problem is that we want to solve with the predictive model. For example, reducing avoidable hospitalizations, or like the project that we're hoping to work on with Quincy, reducing hospitalizations or long-term care admissions in dementia patients. So figuring out that problem and figuring out how we want to, as Ian said, identify those features or risk factors that will help us predict it. And that often involves working with clients like MD-PCP or Maryland Health Choice, but it also can be driven more by research and grant funding. So for example, the COVID hospitalization pre-CH model was built using funds initially from like a pilot grant, and then was transformed into production later. So it can sort of go both ways. So once we figure out that problem that we're really trying to address with that model, and really how we want to address it and the risk factors that we're going to use, the production process itself begins with finding that or accessing like raw healthcare related data. And that's oftentimes, at least so far, has been administrative claims from Medicare or Medicaid. But we also pull in social drivers of health data from publicly available data sources that are at the neighborhood level. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, hopefully it will involve in the future pulling in and integrating clinical data from like EHRs such as Epic to really get really comprehensive health data sources. And so we, every time we build or train one of these predictive models, we take that raw healthcare data that is somewhat live or as live as administrative claim data really can be, and we link it across all of the different sources, claims, hopefully in the future, EHR data, publicly available data sources. We link them all together so that we create this really large person-month analytic data set that has all of the different risk factors and features for each of the patients that we're estimating the model for, as well as the predicted outcome. And we use that to estimate the predictive model itself, and then evaluate its predictive performance. And once we're happy with that, we actually take it a step further and create the individual risk scores or the risk rankings depending on the model. And also identify the specific reasons driving an individual patient's risk. So what about which risk factors seem to be increasing their risk for a given outcome the most? And then we take that, those risk scores and the reasons for risk, and deploy them for actual clinical use via platforms like CRISP, or can also deploy them directly to users like managed care organizations. And that from there, providers and care managers can interact with these results specifically for their patients, and hopefully use them when making care management decisions or treatment decisions, or just sort of to inform that whole process. So this is the modeling approach that we use. It is a discrete time survival model, and I am not our statistician, so I'm not going to go through what all of this means, but it essentially boils down to a logistic regression. And as Ian mentioned, we took this approach that's more of the Ford truck approach because we really value creating predictive models that are transparent and understandable and that can provide clear, actionable output that we can deploy later to users. So this is sort of what the statistical model that all of our predictive models are based on at this point. So we have sort of a monthly process for the actual production side of things. It starts with downloading data and then, checking to make sure everything looks like it should, because you never know with claims data. Then pre-processing it to create that gigantic person month analytic data set that has the different features or risk factors, the predicted outcome events, and sort of takes that and spreads it across over about 36 months for each person. So we create that large data set. We train models or estimate models quarterly, but score them every month based on the most recent set of model coefficients. So we'll then, score the model or train it if it's one of the training months. And then we take those scores and reasons for risk, as I said, and deploy them to the output, deploy them to providers or care managers. And then hopefully that does influence or inform or help decide on the distribution of care management resources. And then sort of integrated throughout this whole process, which has been, I think these two pieces are very important, especially for regular production models, is, soliciting and incorporating stakeholder feedback regularly, from the people who are using the models and the people who are asking us to make the models. How can we make these models better is something that we ask all the time and are really happy to incorporate and to just make these models more useful for the people who actually see them. And then also throughout the whole process, monitoring predictive performance to make sure that we don't need to tweak any of the frequency of training or make sure that it's still working as it should, so that we are continuously giving out high quality, helpful results. And so this is an example of what people see when they actually like what the actual users see, at least for one of our models, the pre-AH model, the avoidable hospital events model. This user interface has each person's risk score as well as these reasons for risk broken up into these different categories, and it can be interacted with and to sort of understand what percentage of their risk comes from what specific risk factors, and hopefully helps, like I said, guide these decisions. And then here is just a quick snapshot of the predictive performance of these models. We've been really happy with these predictive models in terms of their performance really throughout the whole time. And this graph, as you'll see here, I guess so we evaluate the predictive performance of these models using the concentration curve, which is what you see on the screen here. And that basically plots the percent of model-specific outcome events on the y-axis here. So for example, fraction of avoidable hospital events. And it plots it against the risk percentile on the x-axis here. So we are able to then tell, what percentage of avoidable hospital events are accounted for by the top, the beneficiaries with the top 1% of risk or the top 10% of risk. So we can basically understand how or whether the people that we are saying are high risk are the people who actually are experiencing the outcome events, which is a good thing to know, especially if these are going to be out in the world. So this is actually somewhat dated in terms of model performance, but with our Medicare pre-AH model, the top 1% of beneficiaries, so like the most risky people, generally have about 12% of the outcome events, which if it was chance, you would expect they'd have about 1% for 1%, so much better. And then the top percent end up accounting for close to 50% of the outcome events. And the model performance is actually slightly stronger even in the Medicaid population, which is exciting. So the top 1% riskiest beneficiaries are experiencing, 23% of the avoidable hospital events, and the top 10% are experiencing 55%, so well over half of these outcome events. So it's, as Ian mentioned, if you're only able to focus on the top 1 or the top 5 or the top 10% of patient panel, then you're really getting at the people who are experiencing over half of the events that you're trying to prevent and address. And for our newer models, like the diabetes complications model or the hospice end of life model, the performance actually seems even better, with like 10% accounting for over 60% of the events. So we're really excited about these predictive models, and they seem to be a really good base for what I will talk about next, which is merging in this sort of research side and building on this to make it even better, I guess. So as we have talked about already, I guess we have this whole production operations side of things, and we have been working more and more on merging in research into this productions operations work that we're doing. And so the next few slides, and the last few slides really, are going to be talking about a project that we're working on Quincy that we've mentioned a few times already, but that is going to be taking this operations production predictive model framework and infrastructure and really building on it to, I think, what's going to be a really cool research project when it is funded. So this is a collaborative R1 proposal that we're submitting to NIA that's between with UMBC and Johns Hopkins, and it's going to take that risk predictive model infrastructure and create a set of models that is going to be specialized or optimized to predict hospitalization or long-term care admissions for Alzheimer's patients. And then it's going to take that sort of the risk scores and the reasons for risk and pair that with a brand new clinical decision support system that will basically take the output from that model and match it with evidence-based, lifestyle interventions and treatment options, if that's applicable, that providers will be able to look at. At this point, it'll be theoretically, hopefully, within built within Epic, so the providers can look at this this is how risky this patient is. This is why they're at risk, and here are resources that I can give to the patient and their caregiver. These are potential lifestyle interventions that we can put in place really easily, because these are going to be, as I forgot to mention until just now, this set of tools is going to be designed for use in primary care. So the people who are seeing patients, the most in regular settings, how can they sort of optimize treatment for these dementia patients? These are the specific aims for this collaborative R1, and I'm not going to really read them out to you because I think it's pretty much what I just said, but our central hypothesis sort of underlying these aims is that the proactive identification of high-risk dementia patients using this risk stratification tool, followed by the deployment of tailored resources using this CDSS, will reduce acute healthcare utilization, long-term care admissions, and just in general lower healthcare costs for these patients. And it'll also allow providers to equitably target care resources, which will hopefully help reduce disparities in healthcare for patients that experience, or for patients with ADRD. So we have lofty goals for this, and we resubmit in March, and we know it's going to be funded this time around. And Ian, I'll pass it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Leigh. Okay, so we've talked about what we at UMBC have built in an operations perspective, and we've talked about why we think we can leverage that for research. We talked about the specific kind of thing that we're working on with Quincy to kind of this proof of concept, right? We can take something that was built for an operational purpose and we can use it for research. We can use it for both research and operations, right? We're not talking about something that is going to stay kind of researchy, just built with infrastructure that is out in the field, right? It's not that. It's kind of this merging. Again, I don't think they have to be these two separate things. And so now I'll talk about why I think this project in particular is so important. I mean, as Leigh says, it will get funded, but it's hard, right? Because I haven't seen a lot of proposals that try to do something like this. And with the emergence of implementation science and like systems engineering, I think it's going to be more prevalent. But I hope that's true. But I hope we're not just too weird, because really, we're trying to do a number of things at once. We at UMBC have access to administrative data, right? You at Johns Hopkins have access to electronic health records. We have things that you guys don't have. You guys have things that we don't have. What we don't want to do, what I don't want to see in the healthcare system, right, is this continuation of like a one or the other, right? Like, we built this model on administrative data because that's all we have. It's nice because it's standard across everyone, and we can deploy these models for a bunch of providers. You guys have access to electronic health records, which are much more detailed, but you don't have all of the utilization for your people because they don't all go to Hopkins for everything. And you're Hopkins, right? Like, you guys are awesome. Not everyone can go to Hopkins. So how do we knock down this dichotomy, right? And we hope to do that by showing that this is what you can do with administrative data. This is what we can do with electronic health records. This is what you can do with them together, right? So that's one thing we're trying to show. The other thing, right, is this like shifting of the spheres of influence, right? So right now, like, our models are deployed to care coordinators first, providers second, but it's really up to the providers to use it. But the care coordinators have built this into their workflow. But providers are overwhelmed, right? Like, they're getting their own EHR, they're getting reports from 10 different payers, like they're getting a bunch of stuff from Chris. We don't want to add another thing on their plate. But again, you guys are Hopkins, right? Like, you can do that. You can say, this is what you're going to do. This is the business process. This is what we're going to shift our standard of care towards. And so how do we learn from one and the other, right? Like, how do we build a clinical decision support system within a renowned health system like yours? But how do we also build something that can scale and that can, instead of living within a single health system, live within a health information exchange, right? So a lot of different people can use it, not just primary care providers within the Hopkins system, but primary care providers outside of that system too. Next slide, please, Leigh. Right, so we're trying to do a bunch, perhaps too much, but why not try, right? That's all I have to say, I think, unless there are questions. I think the next slide is, are there questions? Are there any questions? We'd be happy to take them.
Gail, you have your hand up.
Hi, first off, I really enjoyed this presentation. So I have I don't know if it's just an innovative thought or an educated hypothesis, but I'll let you all decide. First of all, I do research in applied, work looking at applied research in geriatric communities. And so my thought is, how could your models go about predicting protective events that reduce or prevent risk? And so I'm thinking in terms of modeling propensity scores, look at the protective end of your projections, because I think what you're doing is fascinating research. And I was just thinking about what you were saying from from some of the applied research I do in geriatric communities. And what I'm doing as an observational ethnographer is saying, what are some of the protective factors that can slow down cognitive decline in these mostly racial and ethnic communities. So I'm looking for different things in their geographic space. Like for instance, participant X may have a really supportive family network, but on top of that, they raise their own, food. So they're more apt to, eat healthy, or maybe their built environment is more conducive to their walking. So that would, mean that someone would have to be doing, research on the ground, looking at some applied or protective factors within community. And I would imagine this could apply to other, aspects of research. So that's pretty much my question, because I love the risk part of the model. But then the protective part, I think, would be so fascinating to show on the other end of this. This is what you can do to mitigate or reduce some of those risk factors.
Yeah, excellent question and excellent point. Maybe I can give my thoughts, and then Leigh can give hers. And I have a few thoughts. So first, we have thought a lot about this, and I should have made it clear. If I didn't, I will now. What we have been optimizing in the development and tuning of the model is our predictive accuracy within kind of the standard, regression-based modeling. So we are not the risk factors and the coefficients of those risk factors and significance of those risk factors, we think are indicative, but we're not building a causal model, right? Like, we're not using structural equations. We're not doing the things that you would need to do to really assign, a causation either way, right? Like this is a increases risk, this decreases risk, in a causal factor. That being said, we certainly have seen coefficients in our production model that aren't the sign that we would have expected, right? Like we do see the indicators that people having certain conditions are less likely than others. We see, continuity of care and singular drug use instead of polypharmacy. We see things kind of going the way that we want to. That being said, there's no reason we couldn't, right? And specifically in the geriatric space, we at Hilltop, we have the Maryland minimum data set, so the nursing home assessment data that we could certainly, pull features from and include in a model like this. MDS is great because it has a ton of the stuff that a claim doesn't, right? It has more than just conditions. It has ADLs, IADLs, and cognition and behaviors and all that stuff. We also have something similar for the community-based long-term care population called the IHC. Let's see, it has, it looks very similar to the MDS. It's not identical, but the nice thing is that these are people, these are done for people still in the community, right? And thus not under this kind of 24/7 management that you get in a nursing home. So we could totally do that. It'd be hard, and we haven't done it yet, but yes, I think we could answer the questions that you're asking. It would take, I think, more sophisticated modeling, just because that's not what we optimize for, and new data sets. It's a fascinating idea.
Thank you so much for your wonderful reply. And I'm going to get with my supervisor, Dr. Reebok, and hopefully we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Great, you're welcome. Leigh, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my thoughts are very similar to what you said, Ian, but I do think it will be, we know from like the resilience literature that, lower risk does not necessarily like equate to resilience, especially like across multiple domains. So I think getting some of that data that you were mentioning, Gail, about, neighborhood walkability. We have neighborhood walkability technically, but, getting more detailed information about like green spaces in the neighborhood, or like, community activities, or, so that's sort of more like person specific social support type variables that would come from either like within the home or within the community, I think could really inform like more protective risk factors. I think it just would be collecting that data and incorporating it, which would be, I think, I think as Ian said, it would take some tweaking in the modeling, but I think the collecting of that data on a larger scale would definitely be the biggest legwork there.
Oh,
That would be super cool.
Yeah, well, this sounds great. I'm looking forward to us talking further. Thanks.
We're happy to take any other questions, Conan.
It's like,
Yeah, no, it's fun about, I really like how you're thinking about this from taking the operations or taking the research and tying it to operations and vice versa. It's really nice to see that sort of pragmatic approach. Just like one thing I didn't get, like what's your, if everything worked perfectly and sort of, and like you were able to gather the information that you need, like what's kind of your vision for the timeline that you think that this will turn into something meaningful that can be used in the operational realm to make decisions?
Yeah. So I am not by nature an optimist. I'll say that. But Leigh and Quincy both are. So let me give the glasses half empty view, and then they can counter me. You know, probably one of the most frustrating things I've seen over my career is this like this urge to compartmentalize. It's just like this, I guess it's a human thing, right? Like you want to kind of group like things together and make categories and all these things. And you know, when I talk about this collaboration with other folks in the field, they just don't understand it. And right, because they're like, well, but it should be in the EHR, like it should be in Epic, it should be in Cerner. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not. And not everyone's using Epic and Cerner. So what do you do for them, right? What do you do for your mom who has dementia, who is seeing someone that doesn't have access to those tools? That person shouldn't fall through the cracks, right? So that's my perspective, but it's much harder. It's much harder to do that. So will we have something functional that could sit on top of an HIE? I think yes. Is it going to be as robust as what could sit within an EHR? Probably not. Is it better than nothing? I hope so. We're going to find out. Yeah, but I mean, what I would love to see, right, is again, not this line, not this line between administrative and EHR, not this line between a system and the HIE. I don't know if I'll live to see it. We'll see.
Well, so my glass half full opinion is that when we get funded for this R01 proposal, we will have a pilot of this, plan here that's integrating, the claims and EHR and other things with the risk models and pairing with the CDSS. That'll be, piloted within 5 years. So that's the optimistic goal.
Quincy, what do you think?
I don't know if you.
Whoa, I think you guys have pretty much hit both sides. I think that, I'm going to be the opportunist, and we're just going to say we're going to go for the wins and the low-hanging fruit that we can. So if we have our friends at the Department of Health who love this, and we have our friends at Hopkins who love this, and they take it up, that's great. And then we also have our CMS friends who we can start to lean on, who are having the primary care first initiative, and they already love the pre-age model, or they're very interested in it. So, I think that you have to kind of, things are not linear, and we'll just kind of go where we can go and go where it fits first, and then we can expand from there.
Jennifer has her hands raised.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk and hearing, especially about your interesting project. I guess I am really, blown away by, Ian, your skepticism. I really appreciate hearing it. And I guess, especially because I feel like if anything is going to fly, it's at the state level. And I guess your skepticism sort of having this great professional historical knowledge of how the state functions, really, I guess, I'm reflecting on it, because I think if anything is going to work, it's going to have to be sort of the state who's responsible for, has a huge financial interest in managing the care of people who are dually enrolled in Medicare and Medicaid. And so I guess I'm just like, so I think what you're doing now is really inspiring, and I so hope it does get funded. And I guess I'm just curious, what really if a project like yours is not able to motivate faster change, what would? Because it seems like you're sort of sitting at this particularly important setting where you can bridge research, policy, and practice. And so, how should we as researchers be thinking about what we should be producing so that it's actionable?
Yeah, it's an excellent question and a good point. And I try very hard to hide my pessimism, and I'm sorry if it snuck through. But what I'll say is, like, Leigh and I today were able to talk about a big win, right? Like what we've accomplished with those models. That was a big win. And we haven't talked about the failures, right? Like what I haven't talked about is all the times where I saw other smart people seeing an opportunity and others not agreeing, right? Or institutions being so entrenched that they weren't flexible enough to take advantage of an opportunity, or people and entities being entrenched in the counter argument. What we were able to do with building this predictive infrastructure, and what we're doing with Quincy, it is a pinnacle, right? It occurred because there were a lot of the right people in the right place at the right time with the right ideas. And in 20 years, that's happened once, right? So I am optimistic that these kinds of things can happen. I am also very aware at how rare it is for such opportunities to present themselves. So that being said, like, what does that mean? To me, I mean, I'll just give you my own personal thing. To me, it means to me that I am now an academic faculty member that does not agree, and I'll be blunt, because that's, what else can you do? That does not agree with how most academic faculty members are measured in their performance, right? I will not write 5 papers out of one finding. I will not judge my grant dollars separately from the number of people that I help. I mean, it's the incentives are very different than what I'm used to. And so I will continue, I hope, thinking operationally and wanting to build things that can help people, knowing how hard that is and how likely it is I'm going to fail, and knowing that it doesn't fit that mold. So, but I am just stupid enough or stubborn enough to do that. So I would not encourage others to take the same frame of mind.
But somewhat relatedly, I feel like a lot of this has happened, especially like the collaborations with Quincy that has led to this, has led to the R01 proposal that will hopefully lead to all these really exciting next steps. I think it happened from being in conversations like this, where you go and talk about what you're doing with a different group of people, and they say, hey, I'm doing this, what if we did this together? And I think Ian, the Create model came out of you having lunch with people who are policy people. So I think it's just having these conversations and taking advantage of opportunities when they come up, and trying to create these interdisciplinary projects that I feel like can maybe be more innovative than either of the two people if they stayed separate.
Now that Leigh, I will agree with that, right? And so now I'm going to put on my glasses half full persona, and I will say, maybe the best takeaway, right, is to expect 9 no's before you hit that yes, because if you stop at the 3rd no, you're never going to get that yes.
And recognizing.
Go ahead.
I was to say, and recognizing the value of, the operations, what operations can bring to the table, and recognizing what research can bring to the table, and using both.
Yeah.
Because the operations have sort of a different lane but also different ideas and different like capabilities.
Dan.
You have the optimist and the pessimist. I'm the economist. So I don't know, put on that hat and see if I can help a little bit think through this. I mean, I think so anyway, I love the vision. I love what you've done and where you're going. I think where I'm so forgive me if I'm saying things that you've already done or figured out. I'm still trying to get my head around it, but I guess it's so to achieve the vision, like breaking it down into like its component steps. I think the research project, the proof of the fact that you've pulled this off, proof of concept, a lot of things that go from research to operations happen because there was a huge internally valid, test of a difference. Then, people take it up. Of course, the implementation might be lousy and you might not get that effect, but there's an internally valid, big effect size. So I guess I'm thinking, if you want, especially I guess I agree with what Jennifer's saying. I think for a lot of what you're modeling here, this kind of population risk is I think most important at the state level. Does Hopkins really care about it even under the global, budget model? What are the incentives for different groups? Think about it like a business plan. If you want to get it into operations, where is the return on investment? Even if the investment is just time and process changes or something. But I think doing the research, proof of concept, coming up with metrics for value, to be able to kind of sell it into operations. I think to do it all in one fell swoop, I could see that that it's great, but the people are compartmentalized and they have different incentives, and to get that all right at the same time, I think is hard. So I guess my suggestion is think about, what's motivating people. And I think you're ready to look for the win-wins and take it one step at a time. I'm totally sold on the vision and wish you guys the best and appreciate the fact you came and presented to us.
Great. Good thoughts. Thanks, Don.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I think it's been a great conversation, a lot to think about, and great comments and questions and ideas. So have a great rest of what day is today? Wednesday? Have a great Wednesday, everybody. Thanks for coming.